All right, we're learning we're going to go back to the second Mishnah of Hagon of Nefesh Misrael on page Pei Hey Amid Beis. So on page 85-2. The Mishnah says, we learned this last week, but we're going to go back. Hagon of Nefesh Misrael, one who kidnaps, steals someone. Eini Chayiv, hey Howard, Eini Chayiv, you're not liable for the death penalty, because if you kidnap someone, it's punishable by death. Until you bring him into your property, means into your domain, into your space, means you can't kidnap someone. It's not halachically considered kidnapping if the person remains in his or her space. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, it's not enough just to bring a person into your space, but it says and you have to use him for something, as if he's your servant, he or she is your servant. Like there's a verse says, "V'is amar boy," and you use him. Umachrai, and you sell him. Okay. So the verse that we're referring to is, it says, Ki ish goin if nefesh me'achov. If someone, I'm going to read the verse in Devarim. It says, if someone, we find that someone stole someone, meaning kidnapped someone from the Jewish people, Visamar boy machrei, he utilized him or she and sold. And the person who commits kidnap has to be put to death. Okay, so therefore, the argument is, and we're going to see the Gemara is going to question the opinion of the rabbis. Is according to the rabbis, as long as you bring him into your domain, and the Rabbi Yehuda says you has to bring him to the domain and use him. If someone were to kidnap his own son. So Rabbi Shmuel ben Rabbi Yochanan Beruka Mechayiv. So Rabbi Shmuel, the son of Rabbi Yochanan, the son of Beruka, says that that's considered kidnapping, and you also get put to death for kidnapping your own son. And the rabbis are saying that kidnapping your own son is not considered kidnapping. That's is prohibited in the way that's punishable by death. However, the next case, what happens if you the Gemara is going to explain all these cases. If you kidnap someone, you kidnap someone who's half slave and half free. How could that be? If you're owned by two people in a partnership, and one person releases, this is talking about a Gentile slave that takes upon himself the mitzvos. So he has some of the laws like a woman. He has the similar laws to a woman. So, and now he's half free and half still slave. So the law is that, again, there's a disagreement. So Rabbi Yehuda says that's considered kidnapping and you get put to death. And Racham Paitra and the rabbis say that it's not something that's punishable by death. Okay, so that's the Mishnah. And Rashi says, the fact that it says in the pasuk that there's a second verse. We have three verses that refer to kidnapping. One is in the Ten Commandments, Ariel. The second one is we have in Devarim that says, or the second one really is in Shemos. It says, if you kidnap a person and you sell him and it's found to be in your property, means you've committed this act, you get put to death. We have a verse in Devarim that says, if we find a person kidnaps another person from his brothers, from the Jewish people, use him, sell him, and he gets put to death, we have to get rid of the evil. Okay, so those are the three places that talk about kidnapping, and we're going to understand from the different verses how to apply it to different cases. So initially, Rashi just says that the very fact that it says v'nimtza b'yadai or kiyamatze, we're going to see the Gemara discusses it, but the fact that it says v'nimtza is that it has to be that witnesses find that it's in your property. Okay. The Gemara says like this. So the Gemara asks, Tanakama, you mean to say that only Rabbi Yehuda says that you have to bring the person in order to be liable for the death penalty? So you have to kidnap the person into your property and use him or her. However, if you kidnap someone and don't use them, that's not punishable by death. But we have the verse, and the rabbis seem to say you don't have to use the person, like whatever the kind of use is. So, but the verse clearly says that you use him. He's amar boy. Tanakama loy boy imur. The rabbis don't require that you have to use the person. It clearly says so in the verse. So the Gemara says no. Everyone agrees that it has to use the person. The question is, does the verse mean to say that you have to use him or her means you use them as a servant, or you use their service, or use their body in a way that has value, or even if you don't use them in a way that has value. The Racha, the son of Rabba, says, the argument is, if there's less than a value of a pruta, which is a small amount of money that you use them for, right? Let's say you ask them to just pick up a napkin, whatever, something very small. So according to the rabbis, that's enough. According to Rabbi Yehuda, no, you have to use the person in a way that's a proper kind of use. It means, ask the person to plow your field, or to garden, or to clean up your house, something that you would pay a little bit of money for. Okay. So that's the difference. It means they both agree that you have to use, and the question is if it has to be monetary value. The Gemara continues. Boy Rabbi Yirmiyah. We learned this last week. Rabbi Yirmiyah asked the question: you kidnapped a person, evidently moved the person in his sleep or her sleep. You sold them, so you've done what the Torah says you shouldn't do, to be obligated to be put to death. But the person was sleeping while you did all this. Machar isha leubra, you kidnapped a woman and you sold her for her child. It means you didn't sell her, you just sold that this child that she's pregnant with will belong to someone else. Mahu. Yesh derech imor b'kach or ein derech imor b'kach? So the Gemara says, is this considered you using the person? It means you kidnapped him, you sold him, but the person was sleeping, or the woman was pregnant. The Gemara says, what kind of question is that? There's no use at all. So why? Because the person's sleeping. How could you use a person when they're sleeping? So Gemara says, no, there is a way. You lean on the person. So you lean on the person's sleeping, the person's not conscious of his being used for something, but you stable yourself on that person. Let's say you're losing your balance, and you hold your balance on the person who's sleeping, even while the person stays asleep. Or, hey, Shuki, we're just going back a little bit what we learned last week on page Pei Amud Beis after the Mishnah. We're holding Rabbi Yirmiyah's questions again. Or a woman that you stand behind her in the wind. So the thing is, derech imor b'kach or ein derech imor b'kach? Is that considered using the person or not? The reason why it's a question, the Gemara says, take, we don't know the answer. So so the Gemara says is because the reason why you're using her body for a shield is not her. It's really the size of the baby that's the pregnancy, because it's connected to the pregnancy. So, hey Ariel, because it's connected to the pregnancy, so it's not really a usage of her. It's just of the pregnancy. So if a woman is larger when she's pregnant and you use her body to shield you from the wind, so is that considered use or not? Hey, Bruce. Okay, so guys, I'm good everyone jumped on. This is where we're holding last week, which is we're learning the laws of kidnapping. And so again, there's 3 verses, because we're going to have to understand the verses now. We have the verse that says in the 10 Commandments, do not don't steal, which we're going to learn from the Gemara means don't kidnap. It's not referring to stealing money or property. The second verse we have is in Devarim that says, going of ishu machre, if you kidnap a person and sell them, and we found them in your property, then you get put to death. So it needs to be both kidnapped and you have to sell the person. If you are like pirates, basically, they used to do, right? The pirates would kidnap people. A lot of Jews were kidnapped in the times of the Romans. They would kidnap and sell them as slaves. If you use them, another verse is in Dvarim, Kimati ish goyin of nefesh, if you find a person steals a soul of his brothers, of the Jewish people, and you use them, and you sell them, then the person gets put to death. So we find that there's 3 things that have to happen in order to be put to death, found guilty and put to death in the case of kidnapping. One is you have to kidnap, you have to take the person into your property. So that's the Mishnah says, everyone agrees. You have to sell the person. You have to have usage of the person. The argument between the rabbis and Yehuda is, does it have to have a monetary value or not? The rabbis say it doesn't have to have a monetary value, even if the use is something, any kind of use. It's not considered use, where Rabbi Yehuda says it has to have a monetary value in order for you to be put to death. Rabbi Yirmiyah asks the question is, how do we define monetary value if the person himself is sleeping, doesn't know that you're using them, or if the woman herself, you're not selling her for herself, you're selling her for her baby, and you're having use of the fact that her baby makes her larger, and you protect yourself from the wind. Okay, and the Gemara says, take it. We don't have a conclusion yet on those questions. Now we're gonna analyze the laws of kidnapping. Tana Rabbanim, we learned. Kimatze ish. Again, we're going over the verses. The first verse says in Devarim, Kimatze ish. If you find a person So ish is male. Goinev nefesh me'achav steals a soul from amongst his brothers. So what do we understand from all the wording so far of the verse? Ainli ali isha ganav. It's only, the prohibition is only for a man to kidnap. Isha minayin. What about a woman who kidnaps? How do we know that a woman who kidnaps also gets put to death? A woman's also able to kidnap, right? So if a woman kidnaps, how do we know that she gets put to death? So then we fall back on the first verse in Pasuk Shmois. Tamalemer v'goinev ish. If a man is kidnapped, is stolen, doesn't say who kidnaps, so it doesn't make a difference. Whether it's a man or woman, whoever kidnaps another man gets put to death. So we have so far, if the kidnapper is male or female, then the punishment is death. But we only know so far if the person who's kidnapped is male. What about if a woman? So ein liela ish shigonov bein isha bein ish. So we know so far from the first verse in the Varm that says ish goinev nefesh me'achav. You kidnap any soul. So we know that it doesn't make a difference who the person, the man kidnaps, whether it's a man or a woman. It doesn't make a difference of the sex, whether it's a man and a woman. So the man gets put to death. We have the second verse that says goinev ish. If anyone kidnaps a man, so we know v'isha shagadon v'ish. We know that if a woman were to kidnap a man, that's also punishable by death. That's considered kidnapping. What we don't know is isha shagadon v'isha minayin. How about if a woman kidnaps another woman? There's no indication from the verses about. We know if the kidnapped is male or female. We know if the kidnapper is male or female. If it's a man. But what about if it's and we know a man who, if a man kidnaps a man or woman, so we know all that. But we don't have anywhere in the verses to teach us the law if a woman were to kidnap another woman. Isha shagan v'isha minayin. Talmud lemer umeis haganav ahu mikol makom. The fact that the verse continues in Devarim and says that umeis haganav ahu, that the thief means the person who kidnaps gets put to death, doesn't make a difference. Mikol makom, anything that he does, whether it's a man to man, or woman to woman, whoever it is, whoever the kidnapper is, whoever the kidnapped is, then the kidnapper gets put to death. If, of course, if he kidnaps, brings into his property, sells, and has either a monetary or non-monetary usage of the person. Okay. Now the Gemara continues. Tanya idach. Okay, so basically, what we have so far of the verse is that kimatzi ish goinef. The first verse teaches us that a man who steals nefesh, anyone who's alive, any live being, me'achav, who's a Jewish person from Bnei Yisrael. We'll see what those words mean in a second. The second verse we say v'goinef ish, if a man is kidnapped. So we have clearly indicating that a woman who a woman who kidnaps a man, or a man who kidnaps a man or a woman, that clearly says in the Torah. And then we use the verse that says umeis haganav to teach us also a woman who kidnaps a woman. Yes, Aaron.
Does it bring up if they're married, and does it bring up if they're a child?
Yeah, the Mishnah says, doesn't say about married, and the condition is based. The Mishnah clearly says, brings down an argument between Rabbi Shmuel and the rabbis if you kidnap your own son. I mean, today this that happens all the time. Where in custody cases, where a person is, you see, like I said, you have the alerts. Someone's trying to run away with one of their kids, usually crossing the border on the way to Canada. So you have a lot of cases where there is custody battles, where a parent that doesn't have custody or whatever the situation is will take a child. Now, obviously the conditions have to be there. Kidnapping according to Torah, for whatever reason, doesn't mean to kidnap someone like one of these creepy cases where you find that the person, built a tunnel in their basement and kept them there for whatever reason. That's, of course, you're not allowed to do it. And any other crime you do to the person, all those things. However, one of the conditions of the Torah is that they kidnap to sell. So it was a slave. It was like what's going on in other places in the world today, where people get kidnapped and get sold in the sex trade or other kind of trades. So that is part of what's kidnapping. The kidnapping is you kidnap someone and you sell them. So if you kidnap your own child and sell them, it's not really a custody case. A custody case obviously usually is that you kidnap your child and just try to take them from your parents. But the same thing, by the way, it applies also. If someone were to kidnap their child and put their child into some people do that also. They sell their children for sex trade. That's considered kidnapping and selling, and that would be considered punishable by death. Okay, but it's a good question, Aaron, and we're going to get to those questions. We're going to analyze those questions along in the Gemara. So now we take this. The Gemara asks a question. We learned The verse says that if you find a person, a man, who kidnaps, who steals a soul from amongst his brother. So what does it mean, me'echov, from one of his brothers? So in general, we analyze that word when it's in the pasuk. So it says echad hagoynef ish ve'echad hagoynef ve'isha. That doesn't make a difference whether you kidnap a man or a woman. Then that's considered kidnapping and punishable by death, because it says the word nefesh, any living soul. And this includes vechad ger, this includes a convert, or a eved mishuchrer, or a freed Gentile slave. Once a free Gentile slave is freed, so then that slave, if you were to kidnap him and sell him, and that could be those days was something that was common because people didn't want to give up their slaves, then you are considered kidnapper and you get put to death. Bekatan. Or if you kidnap a child, you would think maybe if the person who's kidnapped has to be of age, 13 or plus, or 12 and a girl. It says no. So chayiv. So then on all these cases, you are considered kidnapping and you're considered liable. However, what happens if ganvu v'lei machru? You kidnap a person, but you don't sell them. Like I said, in the case of custody, right? You're not selling them, you just kidnap the child. Ganvu v'lei machru, you kidnap but you don't sell. Machru v'dayin yashnu b'rshusai, or you sell a person while they're still in their own property. It means you haven't taken them to your property yet. You sell someone who's still in their property. Let's say they're sleeping still in their property. Potter, that's not considered punishable by death. That's not considered kidnapping according to Torah. What about if you kidnap a person, and this is a case of ransom, right? What's ransom? Ransom is you're selling the person back, right? What happens if you kidnap someone and they say you want the person back? I want you to pay. So that's a ransom. So from looking at the Gemara in plain text, it seems like you kidnapped the child on behalf of the parents. But it says, what happens if you sell the kidnapped person back to his father or his brothers or lechem akrayvim, or to any one of their relatives? You may think that it's not considered kidnapping and selling if it goes back to the relatives. The Gemara says no such thing chayiv. If you kidnap a slave, potter, that's not considered. You're not considered obligated in that. I just want to see if there's any Rashis here. So in the case, yeah. So the case, I mean, I guess the case of kidnapping, selling back to a parent, I'm not sure what the thinking would be. Not means maybe you could think what happens if the parents are involved. The parents want to use want to buy their relative, but the same wording would apply, like I said, in a case of ransom, where you kidnap someone, you sell them back to their family to pay ransom. That's all the conditions of kidnapping, and you get put to death. Basically the story of the 10 Asuri HaGemalchus, the 10 rabbis that were put to death by the Roman government in the time. We're not exactly sure when that time period was, but it's towards the end of the Second Temple, because Rabbi Akiva was one of them, and Rabbi Shmuel and Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel, they lived in Misrabi before Rabbi Akiva, but they considered it in a single time frame. One of the justifications the Roman emperor had to put them to death was that they were going to pay the price for Joseph's brothers kidnapping him. He says they kidnapped Joseph, they sold him. What did they do? They kidnapped Joseph, they sold him for money. And so the Roman emperor said no one ever paid the price, right? That your Torah says if you kidnap someone and you sell him, you have to be put to death. And he put to death the 10 greatest of the Jewish people, right? Rabbi Akiva, Rabbi Shmuel, Rabbi Gamliel, Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel, because they had to pay the price for the 10 tribes. Now, obviously that you can't, that doesn't work really. Typically, such a case, you could punish, 1,000 years later generation for it. But the concept of it was that he was saying that no one ever paid the price for the brothers of Yosef kidnapped Yosef and sold him. I mean, that's just in a plain situation. That's what they did. They could give 100 reasons why they did it. They could say that Joseph was rebelling against Judah, he was supposed to be king because he was dreaming about things that he was going to be king. That's all nice and good. But the Roman emperor says, don't confuse me with the facts. You kidnapped him, you sold him. The Torah says that you get put to death. Okay, so now we have a question. Top of page 86.1, page Mishrabi 86.1a in the article. Tana kamed Rav Sheshes. We learned in front of Rav Sheshes as follows. They said that if you sell to what did they learn in front of Rav Sheshes? So the Rashi says they learned this Mishnah that says if you sell to one's parents, to a father, then you're chayiv. Amlei ani shoyne Reb Shimon Omer. So Reb Sheshes says I have another Mishnah, another place that says Reb Shimon says Mei Echav, that part of the what's considered punishment by death of kidnapping and selling is only if you take away someone from amongst his brothers. And you want to say that if you sell to his own family, it's considered chayiv. Again, there's two ways to understand the scenario of the case. The simple scenario would be that it's like I said, it's kidnapping and ransom. That would be selling back to the family. But also you could say that you sell back to the family, you'd sell the child to the father as a slave, which is obviously a crazy concept. So, but any way you look at it, if you analyze the words of the verse says that you're taking the person and you're selling him outside his family, me'echa, from his family, away from his family. So even though you accomplish what maybe you wanted to accomplish by achieving the ransom, but maybe from the Rabbi Shimon understands from the verse me'echa that you have to sell him outside of the family. It means if you were to sell it ransom to someone else or whatever, sell him as usage to someone else. So goes Tani Potter. So we could learn that it's supposed to be the lost Potter, and that's that you don't you have a wrong version of the mission. So the Gemara says, "My kasha, why?" So the Gemara asks on Reb Sheshes, "Why are you getting all worked up?" You have a place that says that Reb Shimon says that it's not considered kidnapping if you sell back to the family. And that's only Reb Shimon's, that's a private opinion, but maybe the rabbis disagree with that. It means the majority or the unnamed group of rabbis. So the Gemara says, no, here we're going to learn this is a famous idea that's brought down many times as a side concept. We can't assume that. Why? We have, I just want to point out something that when one learns a little bit of Gemara, you pay attention to. It seems like that in the tradition of things went, like it says many times in the Gemara, we're going to find it soon coming up in the next parak in Sanhedrin, that Rabbi Yochanan, who was the first generation, and the one who closed the Jerusalem Talmud. He was a rabbi who lived in Tiberias, and he's like the main personality of the Jerusalem Talmud, Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan Rish Lakish, his yeshiva, he was very old, he lived a long time, possibly he saw Rebbe, and so it says, he quotes Reb Shimon Bar Yochai, but it seems very much so that a lot of tradition that we have is passed down from Rabbi Yochanan. So Rabbi Yochanan was definitely very much in part of the Mesorah of our tradition of what we know in general. A lot of times, I'm Rabbi Yochanan, Shimon Bar Yochai. I'm Rabbi Yochanan. So Rabbi Yochanan is a big person when it comes to his saying something that we have a tradition that this is the way it is. So here we find it in this situation here. Okay, so we have Reb Sheshes asks the question. Reb Shimon, which is Reb Shimon Bar Yochai, the student of Rabbi Akiva, who just had his yortzeit in Lag Bomer, he says that kidnapping from and selling back the family is not considered punishable by death. So therefore, the Gemara says, well, maybe the rabbis disagree. He says, no. Why would the rabbis not disagree? Because he is the rabbis. Why? He says, the Rabbi Yochanan, because Rabbi Yochanan gave us a tradition. And this is the way it is. Stamas Nisan, anytime we have an unnamed Mishnah, then who is the author of that Mishnah? It's Reb Meir. Stam Tosefta. If we have a Tosefta, so who is that? That is Reb Nechemia. Means if there's an unnamed Tosefta, it's Reb Nechemia. Stam Sifra is Rabbi Yehuda. Stam Sifri, Sifra is the Medrash on Vayikra. Sifri is on Devarim. If you have just an unnamed Medrash in the Sifri, it's Rab Shimon. So if Rab Shimon says it, so the Mishnah is in this pasuk that it's being quoted is in Devarim, and it's Rab Shimon. So it has to be a contradiction of Rab Shimon in himself. It's not a rabbis that disagree with Rab Shimon, because anytime there's an unnamed Mishnah, it is in these cases it would be in an unnamed Sifri. It's Rab Shimon. V'kula li with Rabbi Kiva. This is the famous idea that everyone is according to the opinion of Rabbi Kiva. So this is one of the sources that says that that we're now in the days of Sfira, that the 24,000 students of Rabbi Kiva passed away, or were killed in a plague or in fighting, whatever the story was. They weren't respectful one to the next. Rabbi Akiva started again with 5 students. Who were the 5 students? Reb Meir, Reb Nechemiah, Reb Yehuda, and Reb Shimon. I believe Reb Yossi. And all of them, basically, the whole Torah is according to Rabbi Akiva. So either their student is Reb Meir, or it's Reb Shimon, it's Reb Nechemiah, Reb Yehuda, Reb Yossi. Each one of them is a student of Rabbi Akiva, means that everything we have of Torah is alibit Rabbi Akiva. That's a famous Gemara. Okay, let's continue. The Gemara says, Hagoinev b'noi. What happens if you kidnap your own child? My time in the Rabbanan. So there's an argument. The Mishnah says, what do we have? The Mishnah quotes that Hagoinev b'noi, the Rabbi Shmuel says chayiv, and the rabbis say it's not considered kidnapping, punishable by death. Again, anytime the rabbis say pater, it doesn't mean to say that it's permissible. Pater doesn't mean mutter. It means you're allowed to kidnap your child. Pater means it's not considered punishable by death. Again, we're going to learn from the Gemaras and the teachers that we know that from the 10 Commandments, this is punishable by death. So we have the verse that tells us punishable by death, but we're going to have the warning from the 10 Commandments. But what about if someone kidnaps their own child? So why do the rabbis say it's pater? It's not considered, you won't be punished by death, by the Bezdin. Amar Abaye says, the Amakra, ki matzeh prat l'matzeh. Because the verse the pasuk uses is, if you find that someone kidnapped someone out of their property into your property, but the child presumably lives in your house. Again, anytime you read any of these insane stories on today, unfortunately, we're reading them more often than we would like, of people who abuse their children, people who kidnap their children. They find the children with chain marks on them. All these things are followed. These are under the laws. So that, if a child is doing things that shouldn't be on behalf of the parents in a kind of slave labor, that's what we're talking about. These are the discussions we're talking about.
This doesn't cover the case of separated parents where one of the parents kidnaps the child from the one who has custody, though.
That's a good question. I was thinking about that because he's using the word kiyamotze, like you're saying, it means but matzeh doesn't have to mean literally in your house. It could be under your jurisdiction. Now, if in the case, good question, if in the case where the court doesn't give any joint custody, right? Let's say the full custody is either to the mother or the father, and the other parent, kidnaps the kid, is that considered not in his domain or her domain because the child has no, you have zero. If you have a joint custody, so it doesn't have to be that you literally took them out of their bed. You took them out of, it means because you have a joint custody, so you also have the right to have the child in your house at sometimes. So you haven't really taken them out of their space. But if, let's say, you have zero custody according to the law, and you went and kidnapped the child, seemingly you're right from what you're saying. You're right that would be considered kimatze, because you're taking the child out. You have no right to have the child in your property. But if it's a case of joint custody or what have you, maybe it doesn't have to be that you took them out of their bedroom. It has to be that you took them out of they don't belong in your space.
Yeah, I guess the question is then, is there a halachic concept of custody for children like we think of it now? Is there halachically a case where a father would not be allowed near the child or something like that? Is there a concept like that?
Yeah, but that wouldn't be in the conversation of kidnapping. Kidnapping is the case is where, first of all, again, the Torah.
No, I understand that, but
in general,
I'm saying if we
is there something to
case
stop the parent from taking the kid
custody, we first have to establish if there is a halachic idea of that custody.
First, I don't. Again, I think if the Bezdin finds that a parent is not suited to be a parent, to have custody of a child, then it would fall under whether it's pikuach nefesh or what's best for the child. It doesn't fall under the laws of kidnapping. It becomes a case of kidnapping, I believe, if the parents are not given custody, and then the one of the parents go and take the child anyways. Again, unfortunately, you hear the stories like that happens, unfortunately, all the time. Then you're kidnapping the child. Now the question is, if the Torah is going to recognize a civil ruling of custody, I believe it would. If it means if the civil courts are going to award custody to a single parent only. Now, the kiyamatzeh part, the rabbis who say that you can't kidnap a child because it says kiyamatzeh and this child lives in your property. Again, that it doesn't have to be living in the house, but if you have custody, that's considered kiyamatzeh. So according to the rabbis, that's not considered kidnapping. Again, doesn't mean it's permissible. It's not punishable by death.
Would that mean essentially that there's such a concept? Because the way that this is all worded, it talks almost as if like parents is equivalent to the word biological parent here, right? But the Gemara is obviously also talking about people that are taken in, adopted, fostered. It's talking about one who has custody over a child, not necessarily one who birthed or seeded a child.
Excellent point, Shoki. The Gemara is going to bring it. Where's the Gemara going to find such a scenario? In teachers. Can a teacher kidnap a student? Means the teacher is given the student, the parents drop off the teacher, the student at home at school. And let's say those days, I don't know, they didn't have a school.
But in those days, that was for like a years at a time.
Yeah. So in those, so the Gemara challenge, the Gemara questions if that's considered kidnapping or not. Can you kidnap a person that's been given to your custody? So it doesn't have to be a biological parent, but if the person's not, if that's considered kiyamatzeh or not. If it means that the person's found in your place and they belong there, it means they were not there, that you took them there. They were dropped off there. They're on a school scholarship, whatever. They're not school, the parents are paying you tuition for that. Again, these are cases that, as crazy as they sound, unfortunately, they happen all the time in one way or another. Again, all the technical parts, if you kidnap a person and demand ransom from a family, and the parents pay the father pays the fee, that's all the parts, and whatever you use the person, let's say according to Rabbi Yehuda, you ask the person to pick up the trash or whatever. So, or according to the rabbis, that you any kind of use, right? Then that's all that knocks off all the checks of kidnapping that's punishable by death. You kidnapped, you sold. Doesn't mean that it doesn't say anywhere that the selling has to be that the purchaser is going to use the purchase as a slave. So Reb Shimon says, the question is, why would Reb Shimon say that Reb Shimon learns me Elchiv to teach us that you have to sell them outside the family? But we seemingly to be because the child is being kidnapped and being sold for slavery. But if the child is being sold back to the parents so the parents could have the child home, so if according to the Havamina, because at the end of the day we stick with Reb Sheshes, and we say that the verbiage in the Mishnah, the lashon is wrong and should be pater. Why? Because he says, Reb Shimon says, that Stam Mishnah is Reb Shimon. So therefore, we do learn from Me'echov that kidnapping and ransom paid by family. The question would be if an institution, let's say, there's an organization, we have organizations that deal with Pidim Shvun, if they paid, if that would be considered all that that even if again they're not buying, they're not buying them for slavery, they're buying them to redeem them. But if that's the question, again, I mean, first of all, this is in the Sheva Mitzvahs B'nai Noach. I'm sure the laws are different because any kind of stealing would be punishable by death, and therefore, for instance, what's going on.
Rabbi, to remind those of the group who have joined after we were at the beginning sections of the Sanhedrin Sidra, the discussion about the 7 laws are that it wasn't just a piece of paper with 7 lines on it. It was books and books and books, compendiums of laws, all constructed on those original 7 concepts. And so in there somewhere there would be something. I have a very small question, just winding back a little bit, also adding what you just used. Does this apply to siblings and family? It's like stretching this out to like Yosef and his brothers, for an example, right? They took him out. He was under the care. I mean, he was older, but in the sense of the group had gone out and then they had sold him to slavery and all, so like that kind of story as well. The mention that you had about, parents who might skip custody and grab the kid and go off to Mexico or some other country, which is very common in the California region, for example. There's also like siblings or older siblings that like whisk the kid away from an abusive home, right? So like I know someone whose older brother like essentially kidnapped them and moved them to New York because they were in an abusive house. They couldn't get help and they ended up leaving. And so this 19-year-old took his 14-year-old brother with him. And so I'm wondering what level of kidnapping would be considered under this, considering he was taking him from like a harsh environment, or like you were saying, buying someone's freedom, or something like that. I'm curious how far this stretches outside of when you say family.
No, but the thing is that in your case, See the case in your case is if someone takes a sibling and runs off to New York to protect the child, there was no selling involved. So it doesn't have the second condition of, hold on, Aaron, second condition of that they sold him. If you kidnap your brother and sell them, that again, these things happen all the time. May not happen. It happens in the Western world, and definitely happens in places like Africa, where kidnapping turns into the slave trade. That's what the slave trade is, right? If you take someone and you sell them into slavery of the sex trade, that's all the conditions. That's called selling someone. That's kidnapping. That's using them. That's all the parts, and that's considered punishable by death. If you again, and also parents or siblings that take, you have cases where children are being held captive by their parents, being forced to do things, being sold for certain things, being used for certain things. Those again, if it checks all the marks, then that's okay. But then it's considered not okay. It's considered kidnapping and punishable by death. Your case where they took the child and they ran away for his safety, that the rabbis would have to analyze if it's even considered kidnapping. Number one, with pikuach nefesh. And that happens all the time where siblings would protect their younger siblings. And but they're not selling them. It means they're taking them into protection. So they haven't done the second part. The case where it gets complicated is in the ransom case, where it's not what the pasuk seemingly means. The pasuk seemingly means that the selling part is that not that you're selling them to get the money back, but you're selling them into slavery, like what happened to Yosef, right? That's what the Roman emperor said. You kidnapped your brother. You sold him to whoever was passing through, the Medanim, whatever, the people going, the caravan passing through. He ended up being used. All the things that checked off. He says that's called kidnapping. That Torah says you get punished by death. Yes, Aaron.
Okay, because you brought up all this kid stuff. There's a thing in Israel, and I'm just using this example, where you get pregnant, you don't want the kid, and so they don't want you to have an abortion. So they say they'll give you money if you'll give up your kid for adoption.
Yeah, but that's not considered kidnapping.
I don't know. I mean, he was bringing
No,
up.
no. I hear you're asking. Technically, there's certain things going on over there. They sell the child. They get paid for the adoption. That's just selling. It's good. I mean, just literally, we had a story. I don't know. We had a story last week. We talked about it. We had a story last week with the Rabbi Samuels from Wisconsin, who used to be in Seattle, came to he was in Yerushalayim for a case where he helped the mother through that process, and the child was getting married after 38 years. So the child was alive, and thankful to Rabbi Samuels for facilitating that.
Let me just say one other thing to what that other guy was talking about. I believe, and I may be wrong, but anytime you do anything to save someone's life, it's no longer kidnapping.
Yeah, but see but where it gets questionable and when it goes to the courts is what one person's opinion is saving someone's life could be someone else's opinion of kidnapping. That's where it gets clouded. It's not always black and white. All right, so the Gemara says so what's the reason why the rabbis say that kidnapping your own child is not considered kidnapping? Because you haven't taken them out. It's not yimatze. It's not taking them out of their so to say where they're found. They're remaining by you. They're a child. They were by you and they stay by you. So he says, Elamiata, if that's the case, Amar Papa, the Papa challenges Abai, Elamiata, if that's the case, we have another verse. The verse says about relationships, right? That kimatze ish, the verse says in Dvarim, kimatze ish misha, a case of adultery. A man and a woman find that a man and a woman are both the woman's married and they have a relationship out. She has a relationship outside the marriage, and the verse continues. Obviously, they both get put to death for the adultery. So here we have a question. Also, the verse says kimatze. What happens if they live in a commune? They're married they're both married. The woman's married to someone else, and the main thing is the woman's married, right? The woman's married, but they have relationships within their space because they all live, like Rashi says, they all live in one house. So she also says kimatze, seemingly that they leave the space of where she leaves her home and goes to be with another man. So maybe in that case where she hasn't left the space, also the pasuk means to say that that's not considered adultery and doesn't get put to death, and that obviously doesn't make sense, right? So he says kimatze isha be'ulas bal hachinami kimatze pratel matzui. If she's found, that means she hasn't left anywhere. They all live in one home. Hachinami de patri, that's not considered adultery, one would think. Again, we have a few verses that we could use in kidnapping. The second verse says, there's two, one verse says, Goyniv ishu machre v'nimtza biyadai. The other one says, Kiyamatse. So Abaye says, Mi v'nimtza biyadai, that is found in your hands, means you kidnapped him. And so it's not Kiyamatse. And therefore, you can't compare it to a case of adultery. And therefore, the case of adultery, obviously, if a woman, any kind of woman, in whatever situation, if she's married, she has a relationship outside of her marriage, it's punishable by death. Whereas in case of kidnapping, if it's a child, then according to the rabbis, that's not considered v'nimtza biyadai. Kamina Amarava. Therefore, this goes back to Shuki's question. Hilkach. If this is our understanding of the verse, that it means only in the case of you have to take them out of where they are. So Amarava Hilkach Hani Mikir Dartigi, Umasin Rabbanan, someone who teaches children, a teacher. And like Shuki says, there's plenty of cases where there's boarding schools, right? So you drop your children off at a boarding school, and the teacher, whatever, the school kidnaps the kids. Again, as crazy as it sounds, I believe there was some crazy story in France in a yeshiva that was happening. The kids were being kidnapped in the yeshiva. The parents didn't know. They were dropping off the kids in France, and they were getting free scholarship, and one of the poor families that were being taken advantage of, and the kids were being kidnapped. I don't know what was happening to them. And one of the boys had escaped. And this is a story that happened a few years ago in France in a religious school. So it's not like these things are just concepts. So Hani Mikri Dartiki, Umasin Rabbanan, someone who teaches the rabbis, means like a seminary, not just a elementary school. That's not considered kidnapping, punishable by death. So again, here we have a second case where it's not that it's permissible, obviously, but the Torah conditions that you have to take them out of where they are. You have to kidnap them, you have to use them, and you have to sell them. So again, there's certain cases that you could check that off on all the situations. Sometimes you can't. So in the case of the kidnapping in the schools or children of your own family, again, not permissible, but it's not punished by death. Now the question is going to go a little further. What about Gon of Misha Chesiv? You kidnap someone who is half slave and half free. Again, the case is where the only way that could be is if initially the slave was part of a partnership, meaning two entities owned the slave, one freed, the other one didn't. So the person is the ownership that owned it and freed the slave. He has some sort of freedom. And the other one, he's part slave because the other partner didn't free. So here we have the Mishnah says Rabbi Yehuda considers that's kidnapping, although only part of him is free, and the Chachamim say that that's not considered free. Now we're going to learn again from the verses what is the basis of this argument. Tanan Has we learned Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Ein lavanim baishis. The question is like this: we know that one of the monetary obligations you have if you hit someone. We have a verse that says that the Torah is talking very interesting of a mamish, a practical case. I'm just reading the verse in Dvarim Kitzeisei. Keep two people are fighting. Yachtav ish v'achiv v'karva eishes echad lahatzilis isha miyad makeu. And the woman steps in to try to protect her husband, and she gets hit. And the Gemara goes into all kind of cases. If she dies, if her child dies, what are the responsibilities if you hit her? If you had intended to hit her or not? We're not going to go into the laws of that pasuk. But from that pasuk we learned there's the laws of baishas. Laws of baishas is that you don't just pay for damages if you hurt someone. If you shame someone. Person is shamed by being publicly humiliated. So there's a value to that, and you have to pay for that. The question is, if you do that to a slave, do you have a monetary obligation to slave in baishas, in shaming? So the Gemara says that Taner Hasim that we learned that Rabbi Yehuda Omer ein lavad baishas. They don't have the monetary. They don't get payment of baishas. You don't have to pay a slave baishas. It says like this. Rashi brings down, Ein lavad baishas, hamavayish is evid if someone embarrasses a slave, leichayvu Torah lasis dame bishta. You don't have to, the Torah doesn't obligate you to pay him the shame. Again, we're not going to go into the laws who gets the money. Traditionally, like if a woman, right, halachically, all money that goes to a married woman goes to her husband or to her father if she's young. And the slave, anything the slave owns goes to. But here, the shame is the person, is the woman herself. So the Gemara goes into who has the ownership of that monetary value. If it goes part to the husband, he gets nechse malug, nechse soim barzel. But that's not the question. The question is just in general: does a slave have boishes. My time. So what's the reason Rabbi Yehuda says that you don't have to pay for shaming a slave? And again, doesn't mean it's permissible and that one should do it. The question is halachically if there is a monetary responsibility. My time is Rabbi Yehuda Amakra, because this is a pasuk, and then you have to look at the pasuk. What is the wording of the pasuk? It's talking about a case where people are fighting a person and his brother. That's only talking about a person who's a brother. A slave is not considered an achiv, a brother. So the benefits of baishas, of shaming, only applies to someone who is a brother. So the Rabbi so the Rabbanan say no. The Rabbanan disagree with Rabbi Yehuda and say you're not understanding what echav means. Echav means echav v'mitzvahs, and as long as he has certain mitzvahs, which an eved does have, so so therefore there is baishas. You do have to pay monetary monies for a person who is if you shame a slave. So here we have the opposite. The rabbis say that the pater that kidnapping by a slave is not. So how does Rabbi Yehuda over here understand from our verse that a half slave and half free person is considered kidnapping and punishable by death? So it says like this. Again, what do we have here? We have three definitions in the pasuk. The pasuk in Devarim says in about kidnapping. Himati ish goyniv nefesh mi'achav. That's one. So nefesh we said means man, female, or male. Mi'achav, from amongst his brothers, would assume to eliminate a slave. Mi b'nei Yisrael, but the Torah then adds to that mi b'nei Yisrael, from the Jewish people. So we have three things that are being said here: Echav, b'nei Yisrael, and mi b'nei Yisrael. Echav would be brother, b'nei Yisrael, one of the Jewish people. From amongst the Jewish people, from amongst is another word. So basically we have three miyutim, three limitations, three things are being limited. So based on this, Rabbi Yehuda understands to include half slave and half free person. Why? My time, Rabbi Yehuda. Savra mi echav. The fact that it says from amongst his brother, like Rabbi Yehuda says before, it's coming to eliminate slaves. A slave that gets kidnapped and sold does not get the person who kidnaps. The kidnapper is not punished by death. B'nei Yisrael, just the word amongst the B'nei Yisrael from a Jewish person. Lemuti is coming to eliminate someone who's a half slave and half free, because he's not 100% a Jewish person. So therefore, such a person also doesn't get, you're not punished by death. But then we have a problem. It says, Mi b'nei Yisrael. It says from amongst the Jewish people. So what's that coming to eliminate? Again, it's coming to eliminate someone who is another time coming to eliminate someone who's half slave and half free. And therefore, if we have a double negative, it's a positive. Two times saying not amongst the Jewish people, not Jewish people. Amongst the Jewish people comes to double exclusion of a half slave and half free is coming to actually include a half slave and a half free person. That's the rule. Double negative is a double exclusive. If it's double exclusion, is an inclusion. But the rabbis say no. Why? Because mi'achiv is coming to say lafuke avodim loy mashma. The rabbis, we learned by shaming that amongst the brothers doesn't come to eliminate a slave, because the rabbis hold by shaming that a slave is considered a brother in mitzvah. So the word by brothers, mi'achav, in our case also can't be eliminating a slave. Loy mashmalu da'achivu b'mitzvahs. B'nei Yisrael, so why does it mean b'nei Yisrael? Mi b'nei Yisrael, chad l'mutei eved, chad l'mutei mi shechetz eved, chechetz ben chorim. Therefore, we have only two exclusions by the rabbis. One is to eliminate slaves, and one is to exclude half slave and half free person. So again, this is based on the rules of Torah. And when we have this 13 meters of the Torah is nidreshes, so we understand from here, from the verse, so the double, according to Rabbi Yehuda, echav is to exclude slaves, b'nei Yisrael is to exclude half slave and half free. From amongst the Jewish people, again, is coming to exclude, so double exclusion is an inclusion, but the rabbis only have two exclusions because mi'achav is not eliminating slaves, it's only Yisrael and b'nei Yisrael, therefore it's excluding the full slave and the half slave. Okay, so we have understanding from the verses. I'm just going to go a little further, and then we'll finish the class. What is that? I just want to connect it to Shavuos, which is next week. Hazara l'goyniv nefesh minayin. Where is there a warning? In Torah, the law is when you have a death penalty, it has to be that the Torah says the punishment and there's a warning. Where is there a warning of the Gain of Nefesh Minayin? Where's the Torah warn that you're not supposed to kidnap? It says clearly in the Torah, do not don't steal. And the 10 Commandments, don't steal, is we're going to learn is a case of capital punishment and not monetary. So therefore, it's not talking about stealing money; it's talking about kidnapping. Last week's parsha, Parshas Bahar, 2 weeks ago, we learned about you can't just sell a Jewish person as a slave. And it's not an argument. One is coming to teach us about the prohibition of kidnapping. The other one is the prohibition of kidnapping and stealing. So let's just go a little further because Itmar is a new case. Will take us a minute. Gemara says, Tanur Rabbanan. The Torah says, Lo signoiv. In the Torah, in the 10 Commandments, it says, do not steal. What is this referring to? Begoinav nefashos akasim medaber. The pasuk is referring to kidnapping, not stealing money. So the Gemara says, Ata omer begoinav nefashos oy eini el begoinav mammon. Maybe it's not. Maybe the Torah is talking about don't steal money. So the Gemara says, Amartit seyu l'mad mi shleisha esrei midas shatar nidreshes ben. Davar alamid minyanei b'ma akasim medaber nefashos avkam nefashos. One of the 13 attributes is that if you don't understand, you don't know clearly what the Torah is referring to, look outside the box. What are the other things that we're talking about? In the 10 Commandments, the other things that we're talking about are punishable by death. So if it's in a conversation of things that are being punished by death, we have to assume that also the stealing part is not talking about money, but it's referring to kidnapping. Tani Yidach, we learned another verse. It says again, in Vayikra, and I think Kedoshim, it's talking about don't steal. That's talking about money. Maybe it's talking about kidnapping over there as well. The Gemara says, go look from the 13 attributes. And the 13 attributes tells you, look at the subject that we're talking about. The subject over there in Kedoshim is talking about monetary responsibilities. Also over here is mammon. Okay, we're going to stop over here. The next piece of Gemara is an interesting piece of Gemara because it goes into the laws of kidnapping, where it gets complicated, where there's two sets of witnesses and hazama. We learned before that hazama, that the only time that it's complicated Rashis as well about if a person's kidnapped. For a person kidnaps and there's two sets of witnesses, because the two sets of witnesses, the witnesses themselves can't be put to death, because each set of the witnesses could claim that they weren't coming to put the person to death because they only have a testimony. How do we use combined testimonies what's the power of a combined testimony? And a classic case would be in a monetary case is if a person has two sets of witnesses on time that of ownership. For instance, a property, we know halachically property, that if you live 3 years in a property and the person says that you're squatting in my space, and the other person says, I bought it from you, but I lost the contract, but I have a few sets of witnesses to prove that over 3 years of time I lived in this house and no one ever complained. So that's a chazaka, right? 3 years is a chazaka. But what happens if you have only 3 sets of witnesses? Each one says that in 2020, 21, 22, you lived in this house, but there's no one set of witnesses that say that you lived at all 3 times. So what would be the law? Do we combine testimony, and what does it mean when it comes to cases of hazama? Because let's say the problem is that if we find out that the witnesses are lying, right? So each set of witnesses could say, well, I wasn't coming to benefit the person in a monetary way, or to basically to take away from the initial owner the monetary value, because I'm only saying testimony in 1 year. 1 year doesn't mean anything. So is that considered a case where you can't be masmin the 8 witnesses? And we'll learn all that in our next class. I'm not sure if it's, I guess it'll be after Shavuos. Laila Tov, everyone, take care, and Freilich Chodesh, take care.
Very well done. Thank you.
Laila Tov.